So Bob, take it away. Ecclesiastes.
Okay. So yeah, I'm Bob Turner. I've just joined Queen Anne Lutheran Church as an affiliate member because I very much enjoyed the forum programs and discussions with Pastor Dan and the Bible studies. And so it's great to be with you today. As the announcement said, I was a Presbyterian minister for about 14 years, serving churches in Minnesota and Nebraska, and then serving on regional and national staff doing planned giving fundraising. And eventually wandered off and eventually came to Seattle University as director of planned giving, from which I retired some years ago. So I want to start out with the question, what is this book of Ecclesiastes? I want to start with and then follow that with a kind of satellite overview of the Old Testament. People talk about an airplane view. Well, this is even higher up from a satellite. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, I consider that the Jewish people's history of God's creation of Israel, God's holy community, a nurturing community, not just isolated individuals, a peaceful community, not a warring and militaristic community, and a fair, we might say just and a community with equity, rather than exploitive, greedy, grasping. Then the Old Testament goes on to the history books of Joshua all the way to Nehemiah, a history of Israel's betrayal of the holy community by following other gods. And since our gods are the sources of value and power for us, following other gods means following the individualistic, selfish, and warring nature of the nations. And that was the constant sin to which various prophets and judges tried to call the Jewish people back to faithfulness of God. And then the prophets, the books of the prophets indicted Israel for the betrayal of the holy community and eventually announced that there would be punishment, after which there would be restoration. The Psalms glorify Israel's God and its kings. But what is Ecclesiastes? What do you make of it? What have you gotten out of it? Somebody get in.
It seems pretty darn bleak to me.
Okay. What makes it bleak, Susan?
It keeps talking about how pointless everything is. That it's just like chasing the wind.
Chasing the wind, yes, his favorite phrase.
Yes, over and over again. I have to say, from a personal point of view, I was offended by the reference to women at the end of chapter 7.
I figured somebody would mention that. Yes, it's a very masculine-oriented work.
Susan, basically, he's kind of out front in terms of what he says. So maybe he doesn't mean everything like he says it.
Let's hope not.
Which makes interpreting the whole book kind of difficult, I think.
Richard, what leads you to say maybe he doesn't mean what he says?
Well, And unfortunately, I didn't print the text and write things down, but sometimes he talks about, all his vanity and there's no future life on earth. And at the same time, he talks about there is a future if you're with God, or if maybe what you do is ordained by God. So he has some things that are not totally negative for some people anyway. And some of them, I don't want to say they're inconsistent, but if I would spend the next 2 days lining them up, there are things that are hard to jive without knowing maybe if he's talking about particular people, like women in the case of Susan, or, whatever. So I didn't think it's necessarily all bad. It's just, my real question is, what's his motive for writing this in terms of what does he want you to get out of it?
It's interesting, Rich, I think, just to tack on to something you said before you asked that last question about the possible inconsistencies in the Book of Ecclesiastes. The rabbis of the early Common Era actually argued that because of these inconsistencies, as well as the fact that it reflects a piety that is not typical of Judaism, were reasons for why it shouldn't be included in the canon of the Hebrew Bible. And they believed, or they argued, that it was Solomon's wisdom not given by God to the people of Israel. And so it was, along with the Song of Songs and Esther, among the last of the books to be admitted, and not without controversy for one of the reasons you gave. Yeah.
Liz, what have you made of this book? It's just
I don't know about the book, but I'm just looking at chapter 5, and I think there's a very sweet verse in there, and it says, he will not remember the days of his life because God answered him in the joy of his heart. So, throughout this, we're promised joy in our heart. That's how I'm seeing that. I don't know. That's too much out of context.
No, I agree with you. There are some joyful things, but there's some others, and it's kind of like, I don't know if he's just on a rant or, what it is.
Joel, what do you take from this?
Well, Bob, I took your suggestion about looking at other books to try to help figure it out. You had mentioned the Anchor Bible commentary of, I can't even begin to pronounce the person's name, and also the Robert Alter book.
Yeah.
And the Robert Alter book is rather interesting because the word that we have translated as vanities, he translates as mere breath, but I guess another word that could be used is steam. Mm-hmm. So I've been thinking hot air, so that the whole thing is all hot air and all the connotations involved with that.
I think that's a plausible translation.
We don't.
I don't know.
We don't know when this thing was written, but a lot of people are thinking that if this was written, what would it be, 3rd century BCE or more recently, then whatever Judaism may have been involved with it has been watered down lightly to heavily by Hellenism, by Greek skepticism. So a lot of the book seems very skeptical of Hebrew thought.
I would agree and disagree with Joel. I'd agree with Joel with regard to the latter point, that this does reflect the influence of Hellenism, which is Greek culture after Alexander the Great. I would challenge him kindly on the meaning of the term hevel, which is the term he's translating hot air. It means smoke in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew. And I think that when we're talking about smoke, that's a very different meaning than what we mean by hot air in I guess you could say colloquial English. So I think of it more, and this is interpretation, but I think of it more as a reflection on the fleeting character of life, on how life is transitory, and because of that, can be experienced as meaningless. If you say the writer is full of hot air, or that life is full of hot air, rather, I think that takes us in a different direction, possibly worth exploring, but different, I think, than what the author is suggesting here. I don't know.
Well, I don't know of any smoke that's involved with cold air.
I do. Smoke and cold air, yeah. I mean,
Smoke is usually involved with fire, which involves hot air.
right, but Joel, the way you're using the term hot air is where I would disagree, because hot air, if you say someone is full of hot air, that's not a compliment, and it doesn't mean the same thing as smoke. So I think the way that I think the fact is that the idiomatic expression of hot air in English does not reflect the meaning of the term in any aspect of its semantic range in biblical Hebrew. That would be my point.
I see. Well, all the stuff I read never used the term smoke, so I'm wondering where you got it.
I got it from Dr. Lawrence, Beatrice Lawrence.
Ah.
And before that, I've heard it from professors in seminary. I mean, it comes from good sources, but smoke, puff of wind, these are all within the semantic range. And because this is recorded, I'm going to have to go back and make sure that's what Beatrice told me. But I believe I got it from her. I got it from actually a sermon I heard first from my home congregation. The pastor was quoting one of our seminary professors. I went to school with her, Victor Gold, who, no, another professor, but anyway, who mentioned that this means smoke or puff of wind. So there's a genealogy there. It's not through academic articles. It goes back to a seminary professor. But totally fair question.
One thing that I really did appreciate about the book was its emphasis on not placing too much importance on wealth, and basically saying that money doesn't buy happiness. And I've just seen that so much in my working life, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. That it can just create almost more problems than it's worth, and it certainly doesn't prevent you from getting sick or having tragedy in your life, or any of those other things that befall all of us, regardless of how wealthy or how poor we are.
So that, at least in that, you see some real wisdom being passed on.
I really do. Mm-hmm.
And I see Liz nodding her head as well.
Well, I'll kind of follow up with that because, you know, if things are too weird, I just skip them, you know, but I think the part that, you know, there's a lot of good stuff in here. Like he mentions that he recommends mirth because man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. And, you know, that's one. And then the words of a wise man are gracious. Wisdom is better than weapons. There's a lot of positive, really great statements in here, I think.
I guess I'm curious to follow up, Liz, if you think it's possible to find gospel in this text.
Gospel as in the Jesus part?
Well, as in more broadly, the good news, promises of God, glad tidings.
Well, that's it. I mean, to me, it's that is part of it, is that we're not just here to suffer and die. You know, we're given a life to enjoy and share with our joy with others. And I guess that's what I'm what I would say is that God gives us good things. That's, to me, that's a core thing, I believe. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes and no. I mean, I think my question is probably trying to bend the Book of Ecclesiastes to my Lutheran presuppositions that one finds gospel in many books of the Bible. But so I don't want to do that. I don't want to force the book to fit my interpretive lens. But at the same time, I know that ever since I've encountered this book, it's always been understood as something negative. And so I kind of want to, I guess what I imagine is, can you ring the Book of Ecclesiastes such that little drops of gospel come out of it? And I don't know if that's the case. I do think it's the case in books that Luther dismissed, like the Book of James. I think there are occasional moments of good news, of proclamation in that text, but Ecclesiastes would be probably the hardest one to do that with, and maybe it should just be left the way it is, right?
Pastor Dan, I'd like to set that question of grace aside for a little later and encounter this a little bit more, encounter the book itself a little bit more before we try to summarize it and force it. Yeah, I was going to suggest that Susan look up the rest of our conversation before, after it's been recorded and made available. Rich, you were saying that you weren't sure that that the writer intended everything. How shall I say this? The way it first appears in the text. What do you see in his writing style that makes you think that maybe it's not all meant to be taken directly?
Either directly, or maybe there's more to it. And so it's not obvious how you should take it. So just in Ecclesiastes 1, I mean, these aren't verses that historically I kind of remember, but you know, the sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south, turns to the north, round and round, goes ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. It's almost like he's writing poetry about creation, I mean, or the earth, or whatever you want to call this. And so, but it's kind of like, but what am I supposed to get out of this? I mean, I agree with his thoughts, and they're expressed interestingly. But how does that get into, you know, vanity of vanities and all of these other things that he talks about?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The commentary that Joel mentioned is by a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary of Korean heritage. And I'm not sure how to pronounce his name either. I don't understand Korean pronunciation. It looks like the family name is Seo or something of that sort. One of his comments is, it may indeed be the intention of the author for the reader to wrestle with the contradictions as one does with life itself. They're contradictory and incomprehensible. Through such a rhetorical device, then, he leaves his reader to recognize that what one perceives at first glance may not necessarily be the reality. There's a lot of argumentative comments in here that often seem to, certainly to me, when I first started looking at this for the first time in a very long time, it just seems awfully contradictory.
And beyond the contradictory, I mean, maybe he wrote it so we would think about these things.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what Professor Co was suggesting in his book, is that the contradictions are intentional. It's a little bit like a didactic argument of, well, it's sort of this way, but then it's sort of that way. And it doesn't have the formal structure of medieval arguments and
Yeah, and
modern arguments, but there's a lot of interesting little comments in here, and they do seem contradictory at times. And I think I like this idea that it's meant to be not, here is the truth, but we struggle with trying to find the truth.
And I think I mentioned Dr. Beatrice Lawrence earlier, who it's nice to have a Hebrew Bible scholar who's a good friend so I can text her. She did say, Joel, that smoke is one of the possible meanings for Hevel, but the other ones also that you read, of course, also being the case. But what's interesting is that even though the rabbis did challenge this text and its inclusion in the Bible because of these inconsistencies, generally speaking, inconsistency is more of a problem for Western Christians than it is for Jews. And Beatrice also likes to say that when it comes to consistency, she says consistency is for pudding. And so I don't know if the if the author or his audience is really working with this same kind of I don't know, set of assumptions regarding how important consistency is to make an argument. This may just be part and parcel of the broader Jewish faith.
Different worldview is what you're sort of saying.
Yeah, absolutely. A different worldview and a different way of being a religious. I was listening this morning to a presentation that included David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, who, as you may know, grew up Jewish and somewhat more recently converted to Christianity. And he said that growing up, they used to have these gatherings where young people of the Jewish faith would get together and they would actually be encouraged to disagree on certain topics and then to find the disagreement, he called it beneath the disagreement, why the people are arguing in the first place. And he said for that community, God is present in the argument itself. And I love that. We tend to shy away from it, both in Seattle culture, and I think it's not always welcome. And so in this case, we're talking about a tradition where argument is not only welcomed, it's encouraged.
I think in U.S. culture in general.
Yeah, I think
you don't
so.
Discuss controversial issues.
Right. So consistency, maybe for pudding. I don't think that way, but maybe this author did.
So what do you see as the understanding of God in this book? Is this Yahweh who called Abraham out of the Mideast, called Moses to bring the Israelites out of Egypt, called David to be king of the Jews?
I'll respond, no. Part one, the tetragrammaton is never used in the text of Ecclesiastes.
He means
Not
that
at all.
The four letters pronounced Yahweh. The
way that you pronounce Yahweh, yes. I'm trying to be Jewish and not use that.
Okay.
So that, no, the sense is more so philosophical than theological.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't get a sense of what we usually talk about as a personal God. I don't get a sense of a personal God at all in the text of Ecclesiastes.
Liz, Rich, how do you react
Well,
to
what
what
word
he said?
they use the word God a lot in here. So what is
Yes.
that if it's
Elohim,
not Yahweh, you're saying?
Right.
not the Tetragrammaton.
You're over my head, but hey.
Tetra is 4.
Means the 4 letters. And
I
it's-
hear that, but
yeah,
so they have two concepts of God is what you're saying?
Well,
there's
yeah.
2
words.
terms.
There's 2 words for God in the Old Testament.
Wow, more than
well,
that.
more than 2.
Well, okay, but primarily
Yeah.
there is Elohim, which is a generic word for God and means any God anywhere. And then there is, I'll be Christian rather than Jewish, Yahweh, which is not proper for a Jewish person to speak that name. But Yahweh is the specific God who's revealed himself in the history of the Jewish people.
Okay.
That name, Yahweh, is never used in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's always Elohim.
Okay.
So one of the conventions you could think of in the English language is if we're writing about the Judeo-Christian God, we capitalize the letter G. But if we're talking about gods in general, gods of some other culture, we don't capitalize the G. That's a little bit like what's going on here with divine names.
Okay.
Or almost in addition to that, maybe distinguishing between God as a proper name versus God as a proper noun versus God as a common noun. The 4 letters which we're pronouncing Yahweh, those that's the sacred name of God, and it paradoxically it's not a name at all. It's the name that God gives to Moses, and it is usually translated "I am that I am" or "I will be what I will be." So it's a name that is not a name above all names for God. And we don't know how it's pronounced because vowels aren't part of biblical Hebrew. They were added much later. And so because of the fact that the proper pronunciation had to be passed down from generation to generation, the name itself took on a kind of, at least this is the way some scholars think about it, took on a kind of holy air, and other names took its place as ways of naming around the name which is not meant to be spoken and really can't be spoken, at least accurately, because nobody knows how it was originally spoken because there were no vowels in biblical Hebrew. So it's kind of wrapped up in all of that.
And to add to the mystique, when it got around to the Masoretes, the rabbis who added vowels to the consonantal text of the Old Testament, and this is like 5th and 6th century BCE, if I remember.
No,
right.
see,
It's more, it's like
Right.
Codex Leningrad or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Well, so what they did was they put the wrong vowels with the 4 consonants. And
that's how we got Jehovah.
Yep.
Right. By the time the King James Bible was being translated, they suspected I understand they suspected there was something wrong with the vowels, but they put it in the way it's written in the authorized text, and it comes out as Jehovah.
Yeah.
And that's where Jehovah comes from.
Yeah.
Now, furthermore, by the time of the Revised Standard Version, they knew this was all wrong, but they didn't want in the RSV to put in Yahweh. So what they did is they put in the word Lord written in small caps. And that's where we get the Lord, so that we would know that that's the divine name, which the Jewish tradition does not pronounce. And so some of our, depending on the Bible we're looking at, we might see the Lord, or we might see Yahweh, or we might even see Jehovah, the divine name.
But when it's Yahweh, it's Lord, capital L, and then it's small.
O-R-D are also capitalized.
Exactly, but they're smaller. Yeah, it's really interesting. Whereas if it's Elohim or Adonai, which Adonai means, can be also translated as the Lord, but it's a way of naming around a name that can't be spoken. So
I think it means my Lord.
maybe, yeah. I mean, I've also heard rabbis talk about it meaning that which is. I mean, but anyway, it's circumlocution. It's naming around the sacred,
Right.
and that's designated by God instead of Lord in most English translations.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so Bob and Joel and all of you who look at very technical words for God, if I go to, for example, chapter 2, and I look at verses 24, 25, 26, where it talks about God giving wisdom, without God, who can eat? I don't mentally think about these other concepts of Yahweh, whatever. I think of more what I call the Christian God. Maybe I shouldn't make that inference, but it's kind of how it's sort of my background.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And why do you think of it in terms of the Christian God?
Well, a couple reasons. It's part of the Bible, I guess. God is capitalized, and some of the attributes are things that make sense to me as part of the God story, whether it's creation or whether it's whatever. So to me, it's not inconsistent.
Sure.
And it's hard for me to say my view of God and what he's saying, the author here is saying about God giving wisdom and whatever. I'm not sure that we look at it the same way, but I kind of have to look at it in context of what I'm used to, I think.
Right.
Unless somebody can give me a way out of that context.
Well, I think there's a way, if not out of the Bible, but maybe out of a more common Christian reading. And I've seen this in Rich and Joel. You may remember we read a book by Lloyd Gearing 4 or 5 years ago called Reimagining God. And Gearing wrote a book. He's an Australian Hebrew Bible scholar and theologian, and he wrote another commentary as well on Ecclesiastes. And what he points out is that the word God here is actually better translated nature. You might say capital N, nature, but they didn't have a word for nature in biblical Hebrew. And what he argues is that this understanding of God is actually one that you find common throughout the wisdom books of the Hebrew Bible, that they tend to speak in terms of what we would understand by today as nature, which essentially depersonalizes God. I haven't read the full commentary. I'd love to go back and find out more as to why Gearing thinks this is so. But I do think it's an interesting way to talk about a commonality among wisdom books in the Hebrew Bible, if not the Hebrew Bible's consistency with the Christian reading on this topic. So it just kind of deepens, it gives us another possibility when it comes to what God may mean in this text.
And Pastor Dan, I've not heard this before, but it suggests to me that this might be a way of kind of universalizing this text so that non-Christians can grasp it without thinking of, the Christian tradition or the deist tradition or Zeus on high on Mount Olympus.
Yeah.
Yeah. But look at it as nature, which might be easier for a lot of people to understand.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. It's almost like liberal apologetics.
Yeah.
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 Which, yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, so beyond God being referred to in a general sense rather than the specific God of Israel, what else do we know about God from this text? Is he a loving, compassionate father figure? Joel's nodding his head no.
I'm waiting for Liz to make a case that he is.
What do you think, Liz? There, you've been
I
challenged.
don't know. You guys are way deeper than I am. I just have never, done this kind of work, but I don't know. Maybe I read the Bible, including the Psalms, where there's a lot of it just seems really negative and weird. And so I just read, and God speaks to me through the parts that he does. And that's what I'm doing here, I think. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. It doesn't mean a lot to me to dissect it. I want a personal God, and that's what has meaning to me.
Sure.
And that's what makes me have my purpose in life. And so I don't know.
Okay.
It's tough for me. Oh.
I understand. Joel, why were you shaking your head no?
Well, I'll quote Brueggemann. He says, "This teaching does not deny that God is sovereign, but only that this sovereign is inaccessible to human faith and is indifferent to human destiny. It is not possible to harmonize this teaching into what is usually taken as the core of Israel's faith. At the most, we may recognize that this material is a remarkable statement of candor that is expressed with great courage."
Huh.
Okay, so
So
go ahead.
my sense is that the kind of God that's expressed is not one who's going to take personal action if prayed to.
Okay.
It's almost, you have a sense that this God is a God of fate as opposed to a God who will act
Yeah.
on behalf of the person who's praying.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Hmm.
quite different from the God that Liz wants to find when she reads the Bible. Am I being fair to you, Liz?
Yeah, but it's making me feel like I'm on the wrong thing. I don't know.
Well,
No.
Well,
Maybe that's not realistic. I don't know.
well, okay. So is Koheleth's view of God reasonable?
I suppose. It just doesn't resonate with me.
Now, to me, it's very reasonable what he says about God, because I read this being part of the Old Testament as kind of the Old Testament God, who's a creator, who's a judge, but may not be very personal, depending on the situation.
That Old Testament God stuff, Rich, I'm never going to be able to handle that. There's too much counter evidence to suggest that the Old Testament God is only one of wrath, or primarily one of wrath or judgment. Although here it does perhaps confirm that. But I guess to Liz's point, Liz, I think the kind of faith you're looking for is what Brueggemann, who's a famous Old Testament scholar, would refer to as the core faith of Israel. And my sense is that what you have in this text is a book written after the exile by a disillusioned Israelite, by somebody who has encountered a very different culture, namely the Greek culture, and its concept of fate. I agree with Joel, except with regard to the epilogue, which most scholars think was added later to make the book more acceptable to Jewish piety. But I think the kind of faith that you're giving witness to, Liz, is the core faith. And I think this book is an outlier. It's written by, I just heard this term this morning and I love it. It's written by somebody who very well may have been a border soul. That is to say, somebody who existed at the edge of the Jewish faith, but also knew quite a bit about the Greek world, and incorporated that into what you might say is his barely Jewish faith in some ways.
I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm kind of pressing that to say that in a way it does give witness to a more depersonalized God, perhaps, but at the same time it reflects to me a kind of life experience that's gritty and not, up in the air scholarly, but gritty, written by somebody who's really been hardened by life's inequities, to the point where he can begin a text by saying all is vanity, or all is meaningless, or all is transitory, or all is smoke, however you want to translate it. So I see him here, a brother in the faith, but not a brother in praise faith. He's a brother in you might say, the faith between the cross and resurrection. And I think we need that too. But it's more fringe, I think.
It reminds me of when missionaries go into a different culture and they adapt the Christianity to include some of the local, whatever beliefs. So maybe that's a way to hold it.
Yeah.
So I want to quote from Professor Sio again. Koheleth reflects an unpredictable world where events seem to spin out of control and social order is completely disrupted. Individuals are vulnerable to all kinds of dangers in the rapidly changing economic world, it seems.
Wow.
Look at the evening news night after night after night. It doesn't depict a world cared for by a loving God. It predicts a world where it shows a world which is unpredictable, unsafe, and traumatic to many, many people.
Wow.
And
I agree, but there's another world. There's a world where people are incredibly passionately helping other people. There's groups all over the place that aren't doing, that are doing good work and that are committed. And, there's two simultaneous worlds. So,
yes. And I think that is part of the reason there's so many seemingly contradictory statements in the Book of Ecclesiastes.
Mm-hmm.
As he's not a pious, traditional Jew saying, oh, everything's fine. He's dealing with the gritty, real world and trying to express that there's still goodness in life if you can grasp it. And maybe this was written at a time when life was really difficult. I mean, we know that in the Middle East, there were wars, there were famines, there were all kinds of disasters. And, this may not have been written at a happy time.
mm-hmm.
So that's part of what I get out of this book. I think to Pastor Dan's comment about the author being kind of on the fringe of the Jewish community.
Tradition is maybe more of what I meant.
Okay. it seems to me that this is like a philosopher. Think of the Greek philosophers who didn't like the stories about Zeus and all of the other gods on Olympus controlling life. And the philosophers tried to examine the natural world and create a non-mythological understanding of the world. I see Koheleth as something in that tradition of a kind of dialogue against the pietistic tradition of his time.
Like a Socrates of sorts.
But yeah.
But look what happened to Socrates.
Yeah, well, and Plato and others had a little better time. Aristotle had a little better time of it. But I see this as a kind of debate and, maybe even a kind of school teacher for people about the realities of the world. And I see this, I still see this as someone very much in the Jewish community. Not an outsider, not a heretic, not someone condemning the tradition, but somebody struggling with how in this world is it so messy, and yet you can eat, drink, be merry. You can take a wife. He explicitly says you can take a wife. I was expecting more women in this group and somebody to grab on that. But anyway, yeah, he's certainly male-oriented in all of his words and writings. But I see this as somebody kind of challenging the tradition and yet from within the tradition. And in that sense, I think he belongs in the Old Testament.
I think that's true. And as long as we assume that the Judaism he's representing has a permeable line for a boundary. I mean, he's drawing on categories foreign to the Jewish world, from the Greek world, possibly perhaps going as far back as the exile. So I would agree. And I think that the best move here was not when the epilogue was written, but when the people who were assembling the canon decided that this book was in. What I think that does is it helps illustrate how Judaism, and I would say in the Christian faith, why Lutheranism at its best is a home for paradox, which is why what you said earlier, Liz, about how we live in two worlds simultaneously, that really struck me as the kind of perspective we find in Ecclesiastes, where this author is able to acknowledge the reality of God and is able to name the good things in life, but at the same time recognizes how fleeting and sometimes meaningless life can be or feel. And so holding those two together, I think, is really testimony to the power of accepting that the world is ambiguous and refusing to fall into either camp, that it's all good, and that we have to be positive and everything happens for a reason, versus it's all bad, where we have to be just give ourselves over to pure skepticism and disillusionment. I think holding the two together may very well be one of the benefits that we get from reading a text like this. Or at the very least, seeing how that the tradition that gathered these books together is trying to hold those two together in the canon, the greatest hits of the tradition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Pastor Dan was asking today, and other times I've heard him, where is the grace in this? I want to tell you what I found, and it was a surprise to me. If the writing of a skeptic, this skeptic, are in the Bible, I want to suggest it means you and I can be skeptics at times, or maybe consistently skeptics. Use reason, doubt, criticize the tradition, and still be members of the church, the holy community. All the things that Koheleth does, we can do and still be members of the church. That's what I think this book means for us. And I think that's where the grace is in this book, is that the community is wider than people who just talk in pieties about a loving God. But use skepticism, use criticism, use rational analysis to look at a messy world ruled by a God who's often mysterious, ruled by political leaders who are often corrupt and mean-spirited and selfish, and all of the failings that we see in the world. And we can still be within the holy community and the tradition with all these contradictions. That's what I see in this. And why I think ultimately the rabbis made the right decision about including this book. What do you think? Am I crazy?
No.
Certainly no more crazy. Certainly no more crazy than the author of the book.
Thank you, Rich.
No,
It's not
Bob,
necessarily a high compliment, but
well, there's different ways to interpret it, just like there's different ways to interpret this book. I mean, you've sort of given me an analogy with all the different things you guys are saying, that this was written by a frustrated guy who wanted to be a reporter for the Jerusalem Times back in whatever time in history. And he wasn't really a good Jew. He may have come from another culture. And so he's confused. He writes different things. And so what we've got are 2 weeks worth of his daily editorials, his writings. And so that fits in, Bob. Thank you.
Either confused or adept at living in two different cultural worlds and being able to translate from one to the other. But what I like about what you said, Bob, was that two things. First, earlier you indicated that let's hold off the question about whether there's gospel in the text for later. I just wanted to lift that up and say how much I appreciated being this point being held toward later. It's really allowing the text to speak on its own terms, and I really appreciate that. I guess what your reading of it did was also kind of expose a bias or an assumption I was making when I asked Liz earlier about, where in the text do you find the gospel? That's an assumption that the text, that a verse or a passage is equivalent to the good news, rather than what you're talking about, which is a more global understanding of this text, namely that the text itself gives us permission to doubt, to raise questions, to scrutinize and so forth, and that's the good news, almost really implicit in the very inclusion of this text in the Bible. And I love that. I think that's so important. And I think it really does, or at least can function that way, to say, hey, there's a place for you in this tradition if you ask questions and so forth. We have precedent for it in the Bible itself. I like that. So Liz, you're not off the hook. Do you think there's good news in this text, or implied by this text?
I do. I still do.
Yeah.
I also want to add a corollary. It's not the whole gospel.
No.
It's not the whole biblical message. It is one author's message.
Yeah, it's like turning a prism or maybe a diamond and looking at how the light reflects it. It's one aspect of the good news that we find in the Bible.
And I think that those things are as individual as each person, you know. I think I just have to go back to that that's what's beautiful about, you know, the faith, is that it doesn't matter what your perspective is. There's going to be, you know, God will speak to that through the Bible. You know, that's how I hold it.
Joel, I'm glad you pursued a couple of those books that I mentioned. Did you find Professor Young's book intelligent? Did you read much of it, or how much did you deal with that?
I didn't get into it all the way. I tried to avoid getting bogged down in it because he gets into a lot of detail which I didn't quite understand. You know, I could, you know, he could, in the early part, he starts comparing various texts, what we have to the Septuagint, what we have compared with what fragments exist in Qumran, aka Dead Sea Scrolls, the various codexes, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I studied Hebrew for a year in seminary. I've forgotten most of it, of course, because I don't work with it frequently. But I found his analysis, and I read the summary at the beginning of the book, and not much else. A little bit of other stuff. It is really technical. I think he was writing that book for Old Testament professors and Hebrew teachers of the Hebrew language. It didn't seem like something written for church pastors. That's the out purpose of the Anchor Bible, but I don't think that's what this book did.
I'm sorry, I've got to run.
Okay, Liz, so good to have you today.
Joining us, Liz.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah, Bob, that was my experience of the Anchor Bible Song of Song commentary as well. The author Marvin Pope just gets bogged down in detail after detail, and it really doesn't seem to be written for pastors. It seems to be written for other experts in the field, and that's discouraging, I think. Yeah, there's speaking of which, I've learned through various commentaries on the Song of Songs that the way that some rabbis justified including Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs in particular was that Solomon wrote, they believed, both of these. And perhaps you've heard this before, Joel, that they argued that Solomon wrote the Song of Songs in his youth when he was overcome by passion. He wrote Proverbs in middle age when he lived a more sensible life guided by wisdom. And he wrote Ecclesiastes when he was in his advanced years after looking back on life and seeing frustration after frustration occur.
In his curmudgeonly years. Okay.
Yes, his curmudgeonly years. What's interesting is that Origen goes back, the 3rd century Greek theologian goes back and changes all that. He says that Solomon wrote Proverbs in his youth, Ecclesiastes in his disillusioned middle age, and Song of Songs as an allegory for the love of God that God has for Israel in his later years. But that the purpose of Ecclesiastes was to inspire that kind of disillusionment over the created world so that we can embrace our changeless, eternal creator. I don't know. It's fun. It makes sense. There's a logic to it. It just, it's so foreign, I think, obviously, to the Jewish perspective.
Yeah.
Anyway. Well, thank you, Bob, for leading another terrific conversation. I guess to all three of you here, would you like us to continue in the summer months, or shall we take a break? I won't be in the area for July. I'm taking a second part of my sabbatical. Certainly be happy to join you all in August if you'd like, or we could wait till September and begin kind of with the academic year. Do you all have a preference? And beyond that, is there any text that you'd like us to read and discuss next? Oh, Rich, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm up at church. Do we have any good short ones to go over? We've done some of the short ones.
Yeah. Well, we've already read Obadiah. And I think we read Philemon.
Yes.
Do you want to do one of the?
Ruth is pretty accessible.
We've done Ruth. Yep. Great text.
Sorry, you've done Ruth?
Yeah, we've read Joel, Ruth,
Oh, okay.
and Obadiah. We haven't read some of the other prophetic books that are shorter, like I'm thinking maybe Malachi or Amos. We haven't read Lamentations, which would be fascinating to read. That's only 7 pages or so. Yeah. Or in the New Testament, we could read one of the pastorals. Why don't we maybe kick that around a bit, and you can send me an email if you have a preference. And then I guess we could also kick around the possibility of when to meet again, but it would be helpful if I had some sense of what your preferences are before we close here.
I think July without you doesn't make much sense.
Okay.
But I'm available in August.
Sure.
I'm not planning trips at that time.
Okay.
Okay, August is fine.
Okay, great. All right. Well, so we'll resume in August. We'll pick something else, something short. And Bob, thank you so much for leading another great discussion. This was really,
Yes, thank you.
really fun.
Thank you. It's fun
It
to
was
do.
great.
I appreciate the invitation to do it. Thank you.
Yep. Everybody take care. Bye.